The detail page is going to need to know the ID of the restaurant to detail. So let me add a parameter to the onGet method, which will be the restaurant ID. I'm going to add that as a parameter here, not a property, because to me this is strictly an input model. Yes, we do display the ID on the page, but that ID is going to come from our restaurant model. And our restaurant ultimately is going to come from the database. To me, the restaurant ID that I need to query the database, that's strictly an input, so I'm going to have a parameter here. We know from previously in this module that I can pass in a restaurant ID using the query string, but I want to explore a couple different techniques for passing a restaurant ID to this page. And so that we can see what the restaurant ID is, before we start querying the data source, I'm going to populate our restaurant property, the ID property, with this incoming restaurant ID. That will allow us to see what this value is. So with those changes in place, displaying the restaurant ID, now it's time to take a look at how can I create a link or a button here that will take me from one of these restaurants to the details for that restaurant. Let's turn our attention then to the list. What I want to do is add another table cell off here to the right side of the table. And inside of the cell, we're going to add some actions as we move throughout the course. So for right now, I'm going to add something that will allow me to get to the details. The next thing we'll add later is something that will allow me to edit a restaurant. But for right now, details. And feel free to add a simple link with text. I'm going to try to do something just a little bit fancier. Yes, I do want a link, so I'm going to use an anchor tag, but I'm going to use some Bootstrap classes to make this look like a larger than normal button. And all this button is going to be is another glyph icon. So this time I want to use a glyph icon, but I want to use the glyph icon known as the zoom in icon. And now, to reach the detail page, all I need is an href. So one way to specify the href is to hard code this. So this would work. I could say when the user clicks this, go to /restaurants/detail. That will get me to the detail page. And then I can say include a query string where restaurant ID equals, and use a little C# expression here to say restaurant.id. So this will certainly work. But this isn't the approach I want to use. I want to use an approach that uses tag helpers. So we already know that a tag helper like ASP-page has the ability to set my href attribute so it points to the correct page. And in general, these tag helpers are the way to approach this problem because the tag helpers know about your software, they know what pages are in place, and they're going to know things about the structure of that page, like what inputs that page requires. And these tag helpers are going to be a little more flexible, so if you change something about the structure of your page, the tag helpers can automatically update the URL. You're going to see exactly what I mean by the end of the next clip, but for now, let's just see if we can get this to work. So I do know I want the href to point to the page, which is the detail page. But it's not enough just to point to the detail page. I also need to pass along this data, this piece of information, which is the restaurant ID. And that's where another tag helper comes into play, the ASP-route tag helper. Now this tag helper is a little bit different than the other tag helpers that I see in the IntelliSense window. Because these other tag helpers, the name that you see here, like ASP-controller, that is the name that you have to use to invoke this tag helper. I have to say ASP-controller and provide some value inside of here. But ASP-route is a little bit different. It's a little more dynamic. What I can do is use another dash here and then include the name of the parameter that I want to pass along. So in other words, if I wanted to pass a search term parameter to some page, then I could say ASP-route-search term equals and then some value. And what ASP-route can do is figure out how it can pass search term to this other page, knowing what it knows about that page. And you can pass as many of these ASP-route parameters as you need. So if I also needed an ASP-route-name, I could add that here too. We just need a single route, and that single route is restaurant ID, and the value will be the ID of the restaurant for the current row that we're on. Let me put this one to the next line so it's a little bit easier to see. And so now I have these two pieces of information here specified with tag helpers. I want to reach the detail page, and I want to pass along somehow a restaurant ID that is equal to this value. Let me save all these files, and let's see if this works. I'm going to come over to the browser page. Let me refresh the list. I'm hoping to still see my 3 restaurants, but now have a link on the right. and I have an HTTP 502.5 process failure. I'm going to leave this in the video because this error does pop up now and then, at least with this version of .NET Core and this version of Visual Studio. And I just want to give you the tip that typically this problem just goes away if I refresh again. And if it doesn't go away, the most I've had to do is just rebuild my solution. And in this case, it's not a problem with your code or with ASP.NET Core. This is a problem I only see during development when I'm making changes and refreshing the browser a lot. So it's a glitch that happens in the coordination between IIS Express and ASP.NET Core and Visual Studio, where Visual Studio is trying to restart my application in the background when I make changes. Once I do a rebuild and I refresh the browser, everything's back to normal. And now I have my little zoom in icon on the right, and if I click on this, I can see yes. That went to /restaurants/detail query string restaurant ID equals 2. So my tag helpers, ASP-page and ASP-route, they decided the best way to pass a restaurant ID to the detail page is by placing the restaurant ID in the query string. And I can ask for now any restaurant by any ID that I want. So when I ask for restaurant ID 10, we'll be querying with a restaurant ID of 10. But this is just one way that I can pass information from the list page to the detail page. Another way, instead of using a query string, would be to place that ID into the path of the URL itself. So something like /restaurants/detail/19. Currently, that would result in a 404 error. Let's see how we can get this to work in the next clip.